In this episode, we're going to take something that sounds like a policy detail and treat it like what it really is, a daily behavior system that either works smoothly or fails quietly. Many new learners hear data classification and think it is mainly a security team concern, but in a real organization, classification only protects information when ordinary people can apply it correctly while doing ordinary work. If a rule is hard to remember, hard to interpret, or hard to follow, it will be ignored or replaced with personal guesses. And that is when sensitive information ends up in the wrong place. A strong governance program cares about classification and handling because these rules shape how people store, share, discuss, and dispose of information, including information that could cause real harm if exposed. The big challenge is not creating strict rules, but creating rules that are clear enough to be used consistently without slowing the business to a crawl. That is the focus here, building classification and handling rules that reduce risk while staying simple, teachable, and practical. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGEIT.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to understand classification is to treat it as a labeling system that connects information to expected protection. Classification answers the question of what kind of information this is and how careful we need to be with it. And handling rules answer the question of what we are allowed to do with it. The biggest beginner misunderstanding is thinking classification is only about secrecy, like classified government documents. When in enterprise governance, it is usually about everyday information that still needs boundaries. Customer records, employee details, financial reports, contracts, and internal strategy notes may not feel dramatic, but they can still create legal, financial, or reputational damage if mishandled. Classification creates a shared language, so the organization does not rely on personal opinions about what is sensitive. Handling rules translate that language into action by setting expectations for storage, access, sharing, retention, and disposal. When classification and handling are designed well, people can make quick decisions with less anxiety because they know what category something belongs to and what that category implies. When these rules are vague, people either overprotect everything, which slows work, or underprotect important information, which increases risk. Clarity starts with choosing a classification scheme that is small enough to remember and distinct enough to matter. If you have too many categories, people cannot reliably choose the right one, especially under pressure. And if categories overlap, different teams will label the same information differently. A practical scheme often uses a few levels, such as public information, internal information, confidential information, and restricted information, where each level has a clear meaning. The real work is defining each level with examples that match the organization's world, because generic definitions can still leave people confused. Internal might mean information intended for employees and approved partners, while confidential might mean information that could harm the organization or individuals if shared outside approved groups. Restricted might mean the highest sensitivity, such as certain personal data or critical secrets that require strong access controls. The categories should be defined using plain language so a non-technical employee can recognize them quickly. When the scheme is consistent and the examples are realistic, classification stops being guesswork and starts being a normal habit. Once categories exist, handling rules must be tied to each category in a way that is both protective and realistic. Handling is where the organization decides what storage locations are acceptable, what sharing methods are acceptable, and what access patterns are expected. Beginners often assume handling rules are mainly about saying no, but effective handling rules are mostly about saying yes in controlled ways. For example, a rule might allow internal information to be shared inside approved collaboration spaces, while requiring confidential information to be shared only with specific groups and with additional safeguards. A rule might allow restricted information to be stored only in systems with stronger controls and monitoring, while discouraging copying it into personal notes or uncontrolled files. The key is that the rules must reflect how people actually work, because rules that clash with reality create shadow behavior. If employees cannot meet a rule and still do their job, they will route around the rule, and that can make the risk worse than if the rule were slightly more flexible. Handling rules succeed when the safe path is also the easy path. A major reason classification systems fail is that they are designed as if everyone has the same context and the same risk awareness. In real organizations, the person creating information may not know all the downstream uses, and the person receiving information may not know how sensitive it is unless it is labeled clearly. That is why classification should be applied as early as possible, ideally at creation, because the creator often understands intent and sensitivity better than later users. This does not mean every email requires deep analysis, but it does mean that core datasets, key documents, and routine outputs should default to a category that fits their typical sensitivity. Defaults are powerful because they reduce cognitive load, and reducing cognitive load is essential for consistent behavior. When classification relies on people stopping to analyze every situation, it becomes unreliable. A better approach is to define what categories apply to common information types, such as employee records or customer tickets, and then allow exceptions when needed. This creates consistency while still allowing thoughtful handling for unusual cases. Another point beginners often miss is that classification is not only about confidentiality, because integrity and availability matter too. Some information is dangerous when exposed, but other information is dangerous when altered or unavailable at the wrong time. For example, financial reporting data that is manipulated can mislead leaders, and operational data that disappears can interrupt essential services. A mature classification approach can reflect this by including rules that protect against unauthorized changes and ensure appropriate access for continuity. This is part of keeping handling rules practical, because people will follow rules more readily when they see that the rules protect the organization's ability to operate, not just its secrecy. It also helps explain why some controls are strict even when information does not seem private, because the damage comes from incorrectness or downtime rather than exposure. When classification and handling consider these dimensions, the organization avoids an overly narrow view of data protection. It also creates better alignment with governance objectives, because governance is about ensuring technology and information support enterprise outcomes reliably. To reduce confusion, the organization should define what data types automatically trigger stricter handling expectations, especially for information that carries legal obligations. Personally identifiable information, PII, is a common example because it can identify a person directly or indirectly, and mishandling it can cause harm. Payment information, health-related information, and certain customer identifiers often require special handling because regulations and contracts may impose specific requirements. Some organizations operate under rules like the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and even when laws vary by region, the practical idea is that certain data categories come with non-negotiable expectations. The easiest way to make this usable is to connect these categories to simple handling actions, like limiting who can access, limiting where it can be stored, and limiting how it can be shared. If a rule requires complex legal interpretation every time, it will not be followed. The aim is to translate legal and contractual requirements into clear operational behaviors that people can execute. Clear translation is what makes compliance possible at scale. Handling rules also need to address how information moves, because movement is where mistakes multiply. Information moves through email, collaboration spaces, ticketing systems, shared drives, reports, exports, and partner exchanges, and each channel creates different risks. Beginners might assume the main problem is sending sensitive data to the wrong person, but the deeper problem is uncontrolled copying, where sensitive information gets duplicated into places that are not monitored or retained properly. A practical handling approach encourages minimal copying and encourages referencing or linking within controlled systems instead of exporting data into ad hoc files. It also sets expectations for sharing with external parties, such as requiring approval, restricting which channels are acceptable, and ensuring only the minimum necessary data is shared. These rules should be simple enough that people can remember them, like a small set of do and do not principles that apply to common scenarios. When movement rules are clear, people make fewer accidental mistakes, and when mistakes occur, it is easier to trace where information went. That traceability supports both incident response and accountability. It is also important to recognize that classification and handling rules must fit different audiences because not everyone touches information in the same way. Frontline staff might handle customer records. Managers might handle performance data and budgets. Engineers might handle logs and configurations, and executives might handle strategy documents. A single rulebook written for everyone often fails because it becomes too generic to guide anyone. At the same time, creating separate rulebooks for each team can create inconsistency and confusion. A practical middle path is a shared classification system with shared core handling expectations, paired with additional guidance for common roles and common information types. The underlying categories stay the same, but examples and typical behaviors are tailored so each group recognizes their reality. This is not about making different rules for different people. It is about teaching the same rules in a way each group can apply. When people can see themselves in the guidance, they follow it more reliably. That reliability is what governance needs to reduce enterprise-wide risk. Many organizations also benefit from defining the boundary between routine confidential information and the highest sensitivity information, because this is where confusion often leads to overreaction or carelessness. If confidential covers too wide a range, people may treat everything as equally sensitive, which makes the category meaningless. If restricted is defined but rarely used, people may ignore it because it feels theoretical. A good approach is to reserve the highest sensitivity category for information that would cause severe harm if exposed or that is subject to strict obligations, and then make the handling rules for that category clearly stronger. Stronger might mean limited access, tighter storage controls, and tighter sharing restrictions, while still being workable. The goal is not to scare people, but to give them a clear signal when extra care is required. Beginners sometimes learn best through contrast, so having categories that feel genuinely different helps. When the difference between categories is obvious in practice, people do not need to memorize lengthy explanations. They can feel the boundary through the handling expectations. A classification and handling program also needs a way to catch mistakes and improve, because confusion cannot be eliminated completely. People will sometimes misclassify information, share it incorrectly, or store it in the wrong place, especially during busy periods. Governance should plan for this by defining how issues are reported, how they are corrected, and how learning is captured so the same confusion does not repeat. This is where feedback loops matter, because repeated mistakes usually indicate unclear rules, unclear training, or tools that make the wrong behavior easier than the right behavior. Some organizations use approaches like data loss prevention, DLP, to detect certain risky actions. But even without focusing on specific tools, the governance idea is consistent. Use monitoring and review to identify patterns and then refine guidance. The point is not to punish people for honest mistakes, but to reduce the conditions that cause mistakes. When employees see that reporting an issue leads to improvement rather than blame, they are more likely to raise concerns early. Early reporting reduces harm and strengthens trust in governance. Training and awareness are essential, but beginners should understand that training is not a one-time event. A single onboarding session will not create consistent classification behavior, especially when employees face new scenarios months later. Effective training uses repetition, simple examples, and short reminders that reinforce key handling behaviors over time. It also avoids drowning people in theory, because most people learn better when they can connect a rule to a real action, such as how to share a report with a partner or how to store a document that contains customer identifiers. Another critical part of training is explaining why the rules exist, because people follow rules more reliably when they understand the consequences of failure. That explanation should be concrete, like privacy harm, financial fraud, operational disruption, or contractual penalties, rather than abstract claims about risk. When training includes both the rule and the reason, people have a mental model that helps them handle edge cases. This is how classification becomes a culture practice rather than a compliance checkbox. Consistency comes from repeated, understandable guidance, not from a perfect document. To keep decisions timely and reduce confusion, the organization should also define who answers classification questions and who approves exceptions. Even a simple classification system will encounter unclear cases, such as a new dataset that combines information from multiple sources or a new use case that changes the sensitivity of data. If employees do not know where to go for an answer, they will either delay work or proceed based on assumptions. Timely governance means there is a clear path to ask, get an answer, and proceed safely. This is where data ownership and stewardship roles matter, because they can clarify how categories apply and what handling is appropriate. Exceptions should not be a free-for-all, because too many exceptions weaken consistency. But exceptions should be possible when there is a legitimate need and when the risk is understood. A structured exception process also teaches the organization, because recurring exceptions often indicate that the standard rule needs refinement. When the organization treats questions and exceptions as part of learning, the rules become better and adoption becomes smoother. As we wrap up, implementing classification and handling rules that people follow without confusion requires treating classification as a human-centered system, not just a security policy. The categories must be few, distinct, and defined in plain language with realistic examples, and the handling expectations must be tied to each category in ways that match how people actually work. Rules should account for how information is created, shared, copied, and retained, because lifecycle behavior is where control is either maintained or lost. Confusion should be expected and managed through clear guidance, accessible decision paths, and feedback loops that improve the program rather than simply enforcing it. When training is repeated and focused on real actions, people build habits that make safe handling feel normal instead of burdensome. For brand new learners, the key takeaway is that governance succeeds when it reduces ambiguity and cognitive load, because people cannot consistently follow rules they cannot consistently interpret. When classification and handling become simple, teachable, and supported, the organization protects sensitive information while still moving fast enough to achieve its goals.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.